There is a pattern so consistent, so predictable, that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The people who need the government the least are the ones the government talks about the most. The entrepreneur who built something from nothing, he's the greedy one. The professional who refused to wait for someone to rescue her, she's the privileged one. The worker who saved, invested, and stopped depending on anyone, not the criminal, not the parasite, not the man who built a career out of redistributing what others produced. The man who simply decided he didn't need to be saved. Ask yourself, when did self-sufficiency become suspicious? When did the person who stands on their own feet become the one that politicians campaign against? When did building your own life without asking permission and without demanding assistance start requiring an apology? This is not an accident. It is not a cultural mood. It is not an unfortunate side effect of well-meaning policy. It is the architecture. Because the savior state, the government that presents itself as your protector, your safety net, your provider of last resort, does not run on taxes alone. It runs on something far more valuable. It runs on your belief that you cannot make it without it. The moment you stop believing that, the entire machine loses its justification. And that is a problem, not for you, for the machine. Here is the question that this video is going to answer. Why does a system that claims to care about human welfare consistently punish the humans who demonstrate that they are capable of their own welfare? Why does the savior state need you weak? Not metaphorically weak, not temporarily weak, structurally, morally, psychologically weak, dependent in a way that feels natural, dependent in a way that feels like the right thing to be. Ayn Rand spent her career asking exactly this question. And the answer she arrived at is more disturbing than most people are prepared to accept, not because it is extreme, but because it is precise. Because it names something you have always felt, but were never given the language to articulate. That changes today. The dependency trap is not a conspiracy. It does not require shadowy figures coordinating in backrooms. It requires something far simpler and far more durable, a moral framework. A set of ideas about what makes a person good, what makes a person selfish, what makes a person deserving, and what makes a person dangerous. And once that framework is in place, the trap runs itself. You were taught to feel guilty for wanting too much. You were taught that needing help is humility and not needing help is arrogance. You were taught that the strong owe the weak an explanation. And if they cannot produce one satisfying enough, they owe them something more. This is not education. This is conditioning. And Ayn Rand was one of the very few thinkers in modern history who called it by its real name. Not a policy debate, not a question of budget allocations or tax brackets or the proper size of government, a moral project. A deliberate, structured, centuries-long effort to make strength feel like a crime and dependence feel like a virtue. By the end of this video, you will understand the mechanism. You will see how the promise of protection carries a hidden price that most people pay without realizing they've been charged. You will understand why the productive individual is not merely inconvenient to the savior state. He is its natural enemy, and you will have the intellectual tools to refuse the trap, not with anger, with clarity, because clarity in this case is the most dangerous thing you can carry. Every government program begins with a promise, and the promise is always the same, even when the words change. We will protect you. We will make sure you don't fall. We will be there when things go wrong. You are not alone. It sounds like compassion. It is designed to sound like compassion. And for many people, people in genuine crisis, people facing circumstances beyond their control, the emotional pull of that promise is not irrational. The desire to believe that someone, somewhere is watching out for you is one of the most human desires that exists. But here is what the promise never announces out loud. Every offer of protection contains an implicit diagnosis, and the diagnosis is this: you are someone who needs to be protected. Think about what that means for a moment, not politically, but personally. When you accept protection from an institution, you are accepting its premise. You are agreeing, at least implicitly, that the threat is real, that you are exposed to it, and that you are not capable of handling it on your own. You are accepting the identity of the person who needs saving, and that identity, once accepted, does not stay in one corner of your life. It spreads. The man who accepts a government subsidy for his business learns slowly to build his business around the subsidy. The student who is told that the world is rigged against her learns slowly to interpret every obstacle as confirmation of that rigging. The worker who is taught that his labor is at the mercy of forces he cannot control learns slowly to stop trying to control them. This is not laziness. This is rational adaptation to a moral environment. If the environment tells you that self-reliance is a fantasy, that the deck is always stacked, that the strong always exploit the weak, that no one really makes it on their own, then investing in self-reliance starts to look like stupidity. And investing in political protection starts to look like wisdom. The savior state does not just offer programs, it offers a worldview. And the worldview is built on a single foundational claim: the individual alone is not enough. Ayn Rand identified this claim as the load-bearing wall of collectivist ideology. Remove it, and the entire structure collapses, which is precisely why it is so aggressively defended, not with arguments, but with moral pressure, not with evidence, but with accusation. Try saying out loud in polite company, I don't need the government's help. I am capable of managing my own life. Watch what happens. You will not be congratulated. You will not be held up as a model. You will be looked at with suspicion. You will be accused of not understanding your own privilege. You will be told that your independence is an illusion, that you only think you're self-sufficient because you haven't fallen yet. And if you have the audacity to suggest that others might also be capable of standing on their own feet, you will be accused of cruelty. The moral trap is already functioning. You can feel it in the discomfort of that scenario because the promise of protection was never just a policy offer, it was a reclassification. A reclassification of strength as blindness, of self-sufficiency as naivety, of independence as a form of social irresponsibility. And once the reclassification is complete, the price of refusing the offer becomes very high. Not a financial price, a moral price. The price of being seen as someone who doesn't care, someone who pulled up the ladder, someone who mistakes their own good fortune for virtue. That price, the social cost of refusing dependency, is the hidden mechanism behind every government expansion in modern history. It is not enough to offer people benefits. You must also make it morally expensive to refuse them. You must make self-sufficiency feel like selfishness. You must make the man who asks for nothing feel like the man who is taking everything. Once you have done that, you don't need to force anyone into the trap. They walk in voluntarily, and they thank you for building it. Most critics of government overreach argue about efficiency. They pull out charts, they cite studies. They show you the cost per outcome of federal programs, the administrative bloat, the unintended consequences, the money that disappears between the promise and the result. They make the economic case, and they are correct. And it changes almost nothing, because the people who built the savior state were never primarily interested in efficiency. They were interested in morality. They built their case on moral ground. And that is precisely why economic arguments, however accurate, keep bouncing off. You cannot defeat a moral claim with a spreadsheet. Ayn Rand understood this earlier, and more clearly than almost anyone. Her central insight, the one that makes her genuinely dangerous to collectivist ideology, was not that socialism is inefficient. It was that socialism is immoral. And not immoral in the way its opponents usually mean, not merely because it violates rights or confiscates property. Immoral because it is built on a deliberate corruption of the concept of virtue itself. In The Virtue of Selfishness, Rand makes a distinction that most people in her era were not prepared to take seriously, and that most people in our era are still not prepared to confront. She distinguishes between rational self-interest, the principled pursuit of your own life, values, and long-term flourishing, and the caricature of selfishness that collectivist morality uses as its punching bag. The brute who takes without thinking, who destroys without creating, who exploits without producing. The savior state needs the caricature. It cannot function without it. Because if rational self-interest is recognized as a legitimate moral foundation, if the person who builds his own life, who refuses to be a burden, who creates rather than consumes, is recognized as the moral agent he actually is, then the entire justification for the state's paternalism dissolves. The savior state does not merely offer help, it offers a moral verdict. It tells you that the natural outcome of individuals pursuing their own interests is chaos, exploitation, and suffering, and that only collective management enforced by state power can transform human selfishness into social good. This is the story. This is the premise underneath every program, every regulation, every campaign promise. And Rand's answer to that story was not a different economic model. It was a different moral framework, she said. The state's not neutral. It is not a disinterested referee managing the chaos of individual ambition. It is an actor with its own interests, its own appetite, its own survival instinct. And its survival depends, structurally, not incidentally, on the expansion of dependency. Think about that with the cold precision it deserves. A state that successfully produces self-sufficient citizens is a state that has worked itself out of a job. Every person who stops needing government assistance is one fewer justification for the bureaucracy that provides it. Every community that solves its own problems is one fewer argument for the agency created to solve them. Every individual who manages his own risks is one fewer voter who needs the politician who promises to manage risks on his behalf. The savior state does not profit from your strength. It profits from your need. And if your need is not sufficient, if too many people are too capable, too independent, too unwilling to accept the role of ward, then the state must do something about that. Not by creating genuine crises necessarily, but by cultivating the sense of crisis, by ensuring that the moral language available to citizens frames independence as isolation, strength as indifference, and the refusal to need help as the refusal to belong. Rand called this the morality of altruism, and she was careful to define what she meant because the word has been laundered into something almost unrecognizable. She did not mean kindness. She did not mean generosity. She did not mean the voluntary choice to help someone you care about. She meant the doctrine, the philosophical doctrine with roots in Auguste Comte and a long career in political thought, that the individual has no legitimate claim to his own life, that his existence is justified only to the degree that it serves others, that self-interest is, by definition, morally suspect, and that sacrifice, the surrender of your values, your judgment, your independence, your life, is the highest expression of human virtue. Under that doctrine, the savior state is not merely useful. It is the institutional embodiment of the good. It is the machine that converts individual sacrifice into collective virtue. And anyone who refuses to feed the machine, anyone who insists on living for himself, building for himself, thinking for himself, is not merely inconvenient. He is immoral. This is not hyperbole. This is the operating logic of modern political culture, running just below the surface of every policy debate, every media narrative, every university lecture on social responsibility. Rand named it. And naming it was an act of intellectual courage that her critics have never fully forgiven. Because once you name the mechanism, you can no longer pretend it isn't there. Let's make this concrete. You probably know someone like this. Maybe you are someone like this. The person who started with very little and built something real, who worked hours that no one saw, made sacrifices that no one acknowledged, took risks that no one subsidized, who did not wait for permission, did not wait for conditions to be perfect, did not wait for someone in an office to decide he deserved an opportunity. He created the opportunity. He created the conditions. He created the result. And now he is the villain. Not the man who coasted, not the man who gamed the system, not the man who built his career on connections, compliance, and the strategic avoidance of accountability. The man who actually produced something. He is the one who gets the speech about privilege. He is the one who gets the editorial about inequality. He is the one whose success becomes, in the hands of the political class, evidence of a crime. This is not a recent phenomenon, but it has intensified to a degree that Rand would have recognized immediately because she wrote the script for it in 1957 in a novel that the literary establishment dismissed as propaganda and that has never gone out of print. In Atlas Shrugged, the most productive people in society are not celebrated. They are hunted. Not with weapons, with regulations, with guilt, with the slow legislative suffocation of everything they build. And the weapon used against them is not envy exactly. Envy is too honest. The weapon is moral language. The productive man is not told, we want what you have. He is told what you have came at someone else's expense. He is not robbed. He is made to feel that he was never entitled to what he earned in the first place. That distinction matters enormously because a man who is simply robbed knows he has been wronged. He can name the injustice, he can resist it. But a man who has been convinced that his own strength is a form of theft, that his independence is a form of indifference, that his refusal to need help is a form of cruelty, that man does not resist. He apologizes. And the savior state needs the apology far more than it needs the money. Look at how the language works in practice. The entrepreneur who creates a company and employs 200 people is not described as someone who built opportunity. He is described as someone who extracted value. The doctor who spent a decade in training, who works 70-hour weeks, who carries the weight of life and death decisions, she is not celebrated for her discipline and competence. She is resented for her income. The parent who sacrificed consumption for years to build financial security for his family is not a model of responsibility. He is a symbol of the gap between those who have and those who don't. In every case, the achievement is reframed as an offense. The strength is reframed as a threat. And the reframing always follows the same pattern. The achievement is disconnected from the effort that produced it and reconnected to the deprivation of someone who did not achieve. Your success becomes the explanation for someone else's failure. Your independence becomes the cause of someone else's dependence. Your strength becomes, by the logic of zero-sum morality, the source of someone else's weakness. This is not analysis. This is accusation dressed in the language of analysis. Rand identified it as the hatred of the good for being the good. A formulation that sounds extreme until you watch it operate in real time, in the comment sections, in the campaign speeches, in the academic papers that treat productivity as a pathology and ambition as a symptom of unexamined privilege. The war against the strong is not fought with weapons. It is fought with redefinition. Redefine strength as selfishness. Redefine independence as isolation. Redefine achievement as extraction. And then watch as the strong, one by one, learn to carry their own success like a weight they owe the world an apology for. The most dangerous outcome of this war is not that strong people are punished. It is that they begin to punish themselves, that they internalize the verdict, that the entrepreneur starts hedging his ambition with performative gestures of social responsibility. that the professional starts shrinking her confidence to avoid the accusation of arrogance, that the individual quietly and without anyone forcing him begins to make himself smaller, not because he was defeated, because he was convinced that being large was wrong. That is the victory the savior state is really after, not your money, not your compliance, your self-concept. At some point in the last century, two things quietly switched places. Dependence became a sign of moral seriousness, and self-sufficiency became a sign of moral failure, not overnight, not through any single law or manifesto. Through the slow accumulation of language, policy, and cultural pressure, until the inversion was so complete, so thoroughly embedded in the way people talk and think and judge each other, that most people cannot even see it anymore. It simply feels like common sense. It feels like decency. It feels like the way things obviously should be. But trace it carefully, and you will find the seam. The person who relies on government assistance is described, in the dominant moral vocabulary of our time, as someone who had the humility to ask for help. The person who refuses assistance, who insists on handling his own life, is described as someone who doesn't understand how the world really works, or someone who is too proud, or someone who, by not participating in the collective safety net, is implicitly withdrawing his support from it. Notice what happened there. The person who takes from the system is morally neutral or morally positive. The person who neither takes from it nor burdens it is morally suspect. This is not a quirk. This is the inversion operating at full power. Rand called this the morality of sacrifice, and she argued with a precision that still makes her critics uncomfortable that it was not an accidental byproduct of collectivist politics. It was the engine. The entire political project of the savior state requires, as its moral foundation, a culture in which self-sacrifice is the highest value and self-interest is the deepest sin. Because if people are genuinely free to pursue their own lives, if they are morally permitted to work for themselves, to build for themselves, to refuse obligations they did not choose, then the state loses its most powerful lever. It can no longer claim the moral high ground. It can no longer present itself as the institutional embodiment of human goodness. It becomes what it actually is, a bureaucratic mechanism for the redistribution of resources and the management of power. Strip away the moral halo, and the savior state is just a very large, very expensive, and very coercive institution. The halo is not decoration, it is load-bearing infrastructure. And to maintain it, the culture must continuously produce people who feel guilty for their own strength. People who experience their independence as a kind of debt. People who understand, not through argument, but through absorption, through years of education and media and social feedback, that the morally serious person is the one who subordinates himself to the collective, and the morally deficient person is the one who insists on standing apart. Look at how this plays out in a specific recognizable moment. A young person graduates from university with a practical skill set, refuses to take on debt for a degree he doesn't need, works aggressively in his 20s, builds financial independence by his mid-30s, and stops relying on any institution to manage his risks. By every traditional measure, every measure that a previous generation would have recognized, he has done something admirable. He has done what adults are supposed to do. In the current moral framework, he is a problem. He is a problem because his existence is a refutation. Every year he spends not needing the system is a year that quietly undermines the claim that the system is necessary. Every decision he makes in defiance of dependency, every risk he absorbs privately, every problem he solves without a program, every year he lives without requiring rescue, is a small but persistent argument against the worldview that the savior state needs everyone to share. He does not have to say a word. His life says it, and that is precisely why the culture moves so aggressively to pathologize him, to find the flaw in his story, to locate the hidden subsidy, the unearned advantage, the structural privilege that explains the achievement without crediting the person. Because if the achievement is real, if it genuinely reflects his choices, his discipline, his refusal to accept a smaller life, then the moral framework collapses. Then dependence is not inevitable. Then the savior state is not necessary. Then the whole story was a lie. Rand's name for the corrected moral framework, the one she spent her career constructing in opposition to the dominant one, was rational selfishness. And she chose that word deliberately, knowing it would be provocative, knowing it would be misread, knowing that the misreading itself would prove her point. Because in a culture that has successfully inverted the moral hierarchy, the word selfish is the most powerful accusation available. It is the word that is supposed to end the conversation. Rand walked toward it instead of away from it. She said, yes, you have the right to your own life. You have the right to your own mind, your own judgment, your own values. You have the right to build something and keep it. You have the right to refuse sacrifice that was never yours to make. You have the right to be strong, not as a confession that requires mitigation, but as a fact that requires no apology. That is not the morality of indifference. It is the morality of the producer. The morality of the person who creates real value in the world and refuses to be ashamed of it. And it is the only morality that the savior state cannot absorb, redirect, or survive. Because you cannot build a dependency trap for someone who has decided, at the level of moral conviction, that dependence is not a virtue. The inversion only works on people who accept it. So what do you do with this? Not politically, not at the level of which party to vote for or which policy to oppose. At the level that actually matters first, the level of your own mind, your own moral framework, your own relationship to the life you are building or refusing to build. Because the dependency trap does not begin in Washington or Brussels or any capital city. It begins in the moment you accept the verdict. The moment you internalize the idea that your strength requires justification, that your independence is a debt, that the life you build for yourself is, in some fundamental way, owed to a collective you never chose and a state you never contracted with. That moment, that internal capitulations, is where the trap closes. And it closes quietly. It does not announce itself. It arrives dressed as empathy, as social awareness, as the mature recognition that no one truly succeeds alone. It arrives in the form of a slightly smaller ambition, a slightly more apologetic posture, a slightly more hedged version of what you actually want to build. It arrives as the habit of preemptively explaining yourself to people who have already decided you owe them an explanation. Ayn Rand's intellectual exit from the trap does not begin with a political program. It begins with a question. By what moral standard am I being judged, and did I ever consent to it? That question is more explosive than it sounds. Because the moment you ask it seriously, you discover that most of the guilt you carry about your own ambition, your own success, your own refusal to be dependent was never earned. It was installed, placed there, layer by layer, by an educational system that taught you that achievement needs a social justification, a media culture that treats producers as suspects, and a political class that has built its entire career on the premise that you cannot manage without it. The guilt is not evidence of wrongdoing, it is evidence of successful conditioning. Rand's proposition, stripped of the philosophical apparatus, delivered at its most direct, is this: your life belongs to you, not to the state, not to the collective, not to the moral framework that was handed to you before you were old enough to evaluate it, to you. And the act of living it fully, building it deliberately, refusing to apologize for its results, that is not selfishness in the pejorative sense. That is the most serious moral commitment a human being can make. The savior state is not your ally in that commitment. It is your competitor. Not your enemy in a dramatic sense, not a villain in a cape, a competitor. An institution with its own interests, its own appetite for relevance, its own need to be needed. And like any competitor, it does not want you to get stronger. It wants you to stay in a condition where its offer remains attractive, where the promise of protection still feels like something you cannot afford to refuse. Every year you spend building genuine self-sufficiency is a year you spend winning that competition without even entering it. Every skill you develop that removes a dependency, every risk you absorb privately, every problem you solve without a program, every decision you make from your own judgment rather than delegated to an institution, these are not small personal victories. They are acts of philosophical resistance, not performed for an audience, not announced on social media. Done quietly, seriously, for the only reason that actually holds. Because your life is yours, and living it on your own terms is not a luxury. It is the point. Refuse the guilt. Not because guilt is always wrong, but because the guilt you have been handed about your own strength was never yours to carry. It was manufactured, distributed, and renewed on a schedule that serves the people who profit from your doubt. Refuse the apology. The person who builds something real, who stands on his own feet, who refuses to make himself smaller to fit a narrative that requires his smallness, that person does not owe the world an explanation. He owes it the example. And refuse, above all, the premise. The premise that dependence is the natural state of the human being. That the individual, left to his own judgment and his own effort, will inevitably fail, inevitably exploit, inevitably need to be managed. That premise is not a neutral observation. It is a political claim wearing the clothes of anthropology. And it has been doing enormous damage for a very long time to people who were capable of far more than the premise allowed them to attempt. Ayn Rand saw the trap clearly. She named it precisely. And she spent her life building the intellectual case for the alternative, not as a utopian fantasy, but as a moral argument. The argument that the productive individual is not the problem to be solved. He is the standard to be defended. You do not need to agree with everything Rand wrote to take that argument seriously. You only need to be honest about what you have felt, that persistent, uncomfortable sense that something in the dominant moral story doesn't add up, that the people who produce the most are blamed the most, that the system rewards the posture of helplessness and punishes the practice of strength, that you have been made to feel guilty for wanting a life that belongs to you. That feeling is not confusion. It is clarity fighting its way through years of noise. This video was the noise removal. What you do with the clarity is yours to decide. If you want to keep seeing the moral machinery behind modern culture through the Rand lens, subscribe. There is more to take apart.